Good morning, everyone. Anthony Francis Gabrielle Jr., or as his friends called him, Tony. I'm proud to stand before you to state that I knew and loved Tony. I knew him since I was 16 when I first started dating his son, David. Dave and I chose the picture you see on these bulletins since this was Tony at the age of 27, and it's also here on the screen. This was right around the time in his life that he and his wife, Evie, joined St. Bartholomew's Church. So what did Tony do in support of St. Bartholomew's, and why are we honoring him? In my mind, when Tony joined St. Bartholomew's, it was one of the strongest eras of St. Bartholomew's Church life. It was the time that in these pews were the Clarks, the Colemans, the Garvers, the Wolfs, the Simpsons. I could go on. It was during this time that the church saw attendance numbers go beyond their expectations. From what I hear and read, our Sunday school had at least 300 children at some point. With our large membership, the church was able to have support for many church activities. Some we do now, and some others that we no longer do, like auction nights, antique shows, afternoon ladies' teas, etc. Tony, along with the others I've named, was in his own right a powerhouse in helping our church to be what it is today. Besides being a devoted and supported parishioner of St. Bartholomew's, Tony served as a junior warden, the chair of Buildings and Grounds. I guess that's where I get it from. It's in my genes. On the search committee at the time, they were trying to call Reverend Edward Martin as our rector, and he gave assistance in many other areas, which David will go into. And I also heard he was a mentor, just to name a few of his accolades. I personally spoke to our former member, Reverend Ed Martin, who was the rector here from 1977 to 1982. Reverend Martin told me that Tony was a staunch Buildings and Grounds chair. He took seriously the maintenance and welfare of the church, building and its grounds. Reverend Martin confirmed to me that Tony was on the search committee along with Bill Smethurst that eventually elected him as the rector of St. Bart's. Before Reverend Martin was elected as our church rector, he was the church's interim. And as most people know, the diocese was not fond of electing an interim to a rector, but it seemed the parishioners really wanted him. So to quote Reverend Martin, he stated to me that Tony moved mountains with the diocese, particularly at that point with Bishop Spong, to make Reverend Martin our rector. Tony knew he was the right candidate and that he knew he would do a good job. Reverend Martin remembers Tony's great sense of humor and his love of piloting a plane, something both he and Reverend Martin had in common. John Bessica wrote to me that he remembers Tony being a great mentor to him. In 1978, both Tony and John were up for the election as the chair for Buildings and Grounds. John was elected, and he remembers Tony being gracious in calling him to congratulate him, but saying, "You're stuck now with running Buildings and Grounds with his assistance." It appears that from 1978 to 1979, John oversaw the church and the parish house, and Tony took the responsibility of the rectory, which at this time in history was not next door. It was another home here in Ho-Ho-Kus. John stated that Tony was a long-time dedicated member of St. Bart's, with his love of the parish obvious, especially in his desire to keep the physical plant in good shape. John also wrote of how Tony was always upbeat and supportive, with a continuous smile always on his face, and that Tony worked hard to establish a legacy for his children and his grandchildren, and that the fruits of his efforts as a parish leader still are here today, and I can honestly concur that. In my opinion, I believe Tony's major contribution to our church was his strong determination of establishing a ministry that we now call outreach. In communicating with Reverend Dan Kreller, I will share a bit of our church history. In the 1960s, at the time of the Civil Rights Movement, Tony was part of a committee of St. Bart's that established a Christian Concerns Committee to do outreach, primarily in Patterson with North Side forces among the Black community. From 1968 to 1974, the church raised about $30,000 to spend in support of Northside forces. In 1971, the Christian Concerns Committee recommended to the vestry that 10% of the church's budget be devoted to Northside. The parish, however, at this time was starting to see a decline. And as Reverend Dan told me, the reason was due to part to demographics, fewer births and baptisms, and aging congregations, and in part the lessening of belief and in coming to church. The church's income was in decline, which led the vestry to cut back on expenditures. Disbanding the Christian Concerns Committee in 1974 was one way the vestry tightened its belt in expenditures. Tony was not pleased with this, and in 1978 he began yearly to appeal to the vestry to restore the Christian Concerns Committee. It took till 1982 for this committee to be reestablished. Though the name Christian Concerns Committee is no longer used, we still have a form of outreach all these years. And in some form or another, it continues to this day at St. Bart's, thanks in part to Tony, his vigilance and keeping something to do with outreach going.
A bit of background on my dad. My mom and dad moved from Queens, New York to Ho-Ho-Kus in 1952. They purchased property at 42 Lakewood Ave and had a builder build a 3-bedroom ranch home. They moved into their home in December of 1952 following the birth of my brother Stephen. How my parents became members of St. Bartholomew's Church. My mom had learned of a woman, Evelyn Royce, who lived up the block on Hollywood Ave, that went to the same dentist that she did in Jamaica, New York. So in the spring of 1953, she put my brother in the stroller and went to introduce herself to Evelyn Royce. When she arrived at the home of Mrs. Royce, she and her mom were out in the front doing gardening. My mom introduced herself, and a lifelong friendship began with the Royces. Mrs. Royce told my mom that they attend St. Bartholomew's Church and invited them to attend. My dad was a faithful member of St. Bart's from 1953 until 1979, when his employer, American Electric Power, was moving their 2 Broadway Manhattan offices to the headquarters in Columbus, Ohio. My dad's quote was, "I'm not moving to Columbus, Ohio." So at that point, he was very fortunate and was able to attain successful employment with Gulf States Utilities in Beaumont, Texas. Whenever my parents would visit Kathy and I, they would attend the St. Bartholomew service, Sunday services, as well as Christmas Eve services. A few of the volunteer work and ministries that I remember my dad doing for St. Bart's were teaching Sunday school of varying grades. I was in several of those classes. Taking his turn at being in church in the early a.m., 1 to 5, during the night watch of Holy Thursdays. Staying overnight and assisting with St. Bart's when St. Bart's had the homeless shelter ministry. He and I would go to Paterson, New Jersey on Saturday mornings when St. Bart's had the Northside Forces ministry, and we would perform home repairs, replace flooring, paint, carpentry, plumbing, etc. He would assist in the kitchen with cooking and cleaning duties for special occasion breakfasts, the pancake breakfast, Mother's Day breakfast, etc., and raking leaves on the church grounds in the fall here. When I asked my brother Steve of his remembrance of our dad at St. Bartholomew's, this is what he had to state. His biggest contribution to me was his teaching of Sunday school. Teaching Sunday school to groups of all ages following the teachings of the Christian Episcopal Church. He many times took an academic approach while teaching, and I still remember today his words spoken. Most people listen to respond. Some people also just don't listen, and a few listen to understand. He always gave back and contributed much more than he received. To me, it's because of my dad and my mom, I am strongly connected to St. Bartholomew's Church, and I thank them for that.
In closing, I thank you all for listening to us and learning a little bit about Tony. We know most of you sitting here today did not know him. The kind, the considerate, loving, and wonderful man he was, who had a strong faith in the Episcopal Church. Tony is very missed, but we know in our hearts he is in heaven watching over us and continuing to guide us in our paths of life. Part of Tony's wishes were to have some of his cremains interred in the original memorial garden of our church, which is in the front. So each time we come to church, David and I are able to say hello to him. Thank you.